Okay, so today is October the 4th. It is 10:07 a.m. and this is Timbot just doing my pre-session checklist, make sure that I've got everything set up, testing audio levels, ready for today's session in which we're going to talk about instantiation. Instantiation is a little bit of a dangerous thing to do in terms of programming, which may seem strange because it's so necessary. Without instantiation, we can't create any new classes. Without any classes, we don't have any functional code, we have no app. So we are going to have to do instantiation, but kind of a pro tip among longtime developers is that they learn to be conscious of when they instantiate classes. They learn to do it in controlled conditions, because otherwise there's two reasons why using the new keyword can get you in trouble. Number one, it's very expensive in terms of CPU use. Okay? Creating new objects means that the computer has to allocate memory, and that is one of the most difficult things that has to happen in the background processes in your computer. So if you're doing it at the wrong time, it can actually slow down the performance of your application at a very, very key moment for the user experience. So for instance, you've probably seen cases where you're using an app and it starts to chug a little bit, like there's some kind of transition and it looks very janky and slow, and it still does the transition, but it disrupts the user experience and it sort of erodes your confidence in that app, because you're thinking, well, if this simple little animation isn't working right, then, maybe there's a lot more in this app that's going wrong. Do I really want to use it? So a good developer will learn to time when they use that new keyword, when they instantiate things, so that it doesn't interrupt the user experience. But the second and more important reason why we need to be conscious of using the new keyword is that it can cause a lot of unexpected problems inside of your code from a functional and logical standpoint. So there was an example earlier in the semester from Travis. He encountered this problem very early on, which actually made me very happy because now we can talk about it. We have this data class, all right? And we're counting on using the data that's inside of it throughout our application. We've seen how we use it at the logic level. Now we're using it at the level of the view and rendering it to the screen. But that is a potential problem, because the way we've architected it, and this is the right way of architecting it, the logic doesn't really know about the view, and yet they're both looking at this data, right? Now, what would happen if another instance of that data got created? Well, the logic might be updating the first instance, but the view is looking at the second instance, and now we have a problem where they're not really staying in sync, and that problem is actually very, very difficult to track down, because it's not really going to throw bugs or errors into our console, but it's just not doing what it should be doing. So in the last session, we dealt with that problem. We used, probably the most common method, which is called dependency injection. Now, in dependency injection, we basically create a class whose job is to set up and coordinate the access to that instance that we're using. I can explain that a little bit better. So if you look in our code, we now have one line only where we say new data in order to make an instance of the data class. But you'll notice that that code now also needs to inject that single instance into a couple of different places. That's okay for what we're doing here, because we don't have that much code. We've got less than 6 classes that we're working in. But you can imagine that if you had hundreds or maybe even thousands of classes, and this one piece of code is responsible for injecting that instance into anyone who needs it, it can start to become a little bit difficult keeping track of that. So today I'm going to show you 2 additional techniques that can help you control instantiation and are actually a little bit easier to use then dependency injection. We'll implement it into the crowdfunding project that we've been working on. And we'll talk about some of the dangers with this technique, because usually with every technique you learn, there's an upside, but there's also a downside. So you need to know when to apply the technique. That's what's on deck for today.